Um, Good afternoon, I guess it's afternoon, so good afternoon. Thanks for coming on this beautiful day. Christa, you must have brought the good weather today.
I usually bring rain, so hey.
There you go. My name is Sarah Ripp. I'm the undergrad advisor and outreach coordinator for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. And we're so pleased to have you today. There's some new folks I've never seen before, so that's always fun. And we even have a new guy for our program, which we love.
Sign them up.
So there's coffee and tea and snacks in the back that you're welcome to. And there's also a sign-in sheet there if you're interested in being added to our listserv. We send out an email, sort of newsletter once a week of all of our events and some other things happening in the area that deal with our region. There's also a packet of info with a list of all the rest of the remaining lunchtime lectures for the rest of our semester, and some info about our programs and brochures. So thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to Alberto Vargas.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. One of the things that I really like about our program is that we are able to push the limits. And in this case, we're having a professor in English giving a lecture here in the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. That it's a really great pleasure. So Christa is an assistant professor in the Department of English. She got her PhD in University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and a master's from NYU, New York University, in performance studies. Christa is an expert in rhetorical history, theory, and criticism, visual rhetoric, and Latin America. I saw Christa presenting work with her new book, Identity in Ecuador. And it's a really wonderful book. So, Christa, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, LACIS, for having me. Thank you, Alberto, for the introduction and for bringing me into LACIS in so many different ways. I've appreciated it. And Sarah for coordinating this as well. So. The material that I'm going to share with you this afternoon comes from my relatively new book project. So the book about national identity in Ecuador has come out, and now I'm starting the new work. And I'm going to take a few seconds to set today's talk in the context of that larger project so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from. The new book is tentatively titled American Among Americans, Envisioning Hemispheric Power from the Monroe Doctrine to the Cold War. And it grapples with how visions and pictures of Latin America circulate within the idea of the United States. It started from a relatively simple question. How come the United States gets to be America when there are at least 24 American nation states? And while I'm not giving a history of the emergence of that concept, I am instead looking at how that claim to be American becomes common sense, becomes something that people in the US can say without even thinking about it. That US claim to unmodified use of a name shared by 2 continents worth of nation states is frequently unremarked in the United States, at least. But that tacit sense of possession has roots and implications that extend beyond simple matters of naming. It has undergirded the United States' rhetorical, political, and economic narratives of hemispheric dominance. It has also provided sustenance to one of the nation's enduring beliefs, the idea of American exceptionalism. Asserting a status as particularly American among other Americans relies on a network of assumed contrasts that consistently position the US as the ideal representative of the New World. Anglo versus Iberian, segregation versus miscegenation, Protestant versus Catholic, republicanism versus despotism, and as always, the United States aimed toward the future and Latin America irrevocably tied toward the past. These contrasts consistently appear in US discourse that sets up this idea of the United States as ideal. That claim to America has circulated widely and in multiple forms. It appears in speeches and pamphlets, paintings and film strips, magazine spreads, and travelers' accounts. Like all rhetorical discourse, and here if you are not a rhetorician is your definition of rhetoric, it is communication that has designs on the values and beliefs of others, both within and beyond the United States. So in this new book, I will be suggesting that we can best understand the United States' apparent exceptional claim to America by turning attention to the exact places that claim seeks to ignore or erase. The United States has often eclipsed Latin America by looking closely at it, not only talking about Latin America, but constantly depicting it, in order to help US audiences imagine themselves. Repeatedly seeing Latin America, US Americans have learned to see ourselves, our country, and our own exceptional identity, or apparently so. We have looked beyond the Rio Bravo and seen ourselves reflected back. Becoming particularly American among Americans, in other words, has required extended, explicit, and repeated imaging of the rest of America, remembering it in order to forget, and seeing it in order to eclipse. So in that book, I'm looking at 4 historical case studies that epitomize the long history of learning to see. Broadsheets and prints that circulated during the US-Mexican War, landscape paintings of the Andes that drew massive crowds in the north during the late 19th century, photographs of Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham, which I'll discuss today, and films produced by Disney, often in collaboration with the US State Department during World War II. Those cases unveil a highly visual, highly formative relationship between Latin American scenes and US national identity. They highlight as well the intricate forms of interdependence that undergird US claims to be exceptional. So with that larger frame in mind, let's turn to the case of Hiram Bingham, the Monroe Doctrine, and the discovery of Machu Picchu. Though I imagine that many, if not all of you, are familiar with the Monroe Doctrine, let me offer a few quotations by way of reminder. First, from the doctrine itself, the crucial lines that President James Monroe spoke to Congress in 1823. The American continents, by free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by European powers. And we should consider any attempt to extend their, meaning the European system, to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our, meaning the United States' peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. This stops being true about 70 years later. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, we could not view any interposition, as it turns out 20 years later, except our own, in any other light that is the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. That's the original Monroe Doctrine. And now Hiram Bingham can bring us into the 20th century. From such a high-minded and altruistic position as the previous quotations suggest, it is a far cry to the connotation which goes with the Monroe Doctrine in the minds of many American citizens of today. Our people have been taught to believe that the Monroe Doctrine means that it is our duty to keep America in order. Bingham goes on to track the history of that transformation in political thought, a trajectory that includes the war against Mexico in 1846, the annexation of nearly half of Mexico's territory in 1848, and the usurpation of Spain's remaining colonies in the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, in 1898. All this, Bingham notes, and actually not only the Caribbean, but also the Philippines at this point. All this, Bingham notes, has occurred under the aegis of the Monroe Doctrine, even as it thoroughly contradicts the statements of the original Declaration. And so Bingham concludes, it's no wonder that Monroeism, as it is called in South America, has come to mean to the Latin American mind interference, intervention, tutelage, and patronizing insolence. The connotation does us infinite harm. Bingham presented versions of this argument against the Monroe Doctrine in scholarly articles, in popular magazines, and in public lectures. He asserted that the 20th century application of the Monroe Doctrine was insulting to the United States' more powerful southern neighbors, that it encouraged irresponsibility among weaker southern neighbors, and that it was entirely contrary to the long-term interests of the US, and that in fact, Monroe Doctrine had come to mean anything we want to do internationally, and therefore had also entirely outlived its usefulness. He called attention to the resentment with which Latin Americans viewed the doctrine, and described that resentment as entirely justified. There is good reason, he said, that when US leaders declared America for the Americans, as they often did, Latin Americans heard America for the North Americans. Let me shift away now from Bingham's commentary on the Monroe Doctrine and turn instead to how he describes his encounter with Machu Picchu and his exploration of pre-Columbian ruins in south-central Peru. Unlike the rather straightforward point of his previous quotations, this quotation is going to take a little bit of context to get to the point. And over the rest of the talk, I'll ask you to pay attention to 2 themes going on in the quotation. Those themes show just how thoroughly the assumptions of Monroeism permeate Bingham's own Latin American visions. Those themes are first, the sense of Latin America being available to a US visitor, present here in Bingham's assertion of a virgin field. And second, the way that Bingham draws an affinity between a US, us, reading and the greatness of the Incas and their predecessors. For the moment, though, I'll focus just on that first comment, unpacking the Monroe-ish baggage that weights Bingham's claim about the Urubamba Valley being a virgin field. This quotation appears in a 1913 article published in Harper's Magazine. And I'll talk about two April 1913 articles. There's one in Harper's and one in National Geographic. So this is the Harper's one. Published under the title, The Discovery of Machu Picchu. It comes immediately after Bingham describes his first encounter with the mountain retreat. Based on Bingham's description of that visit, only a reader who already assumes that America is for the North Americans, can understand Bingham's story in terms of a discovery made in virgin territory. The tale opens with Bingham hearing rumors of spectacular ruins at a place called Machu Picchu. Then, aided by a Peruvian soldier and led by an indigenous guide who had visited the site before, Bingham follows the Urubamba Road that had been built recently by the Peruvian government. Leaving the road, he and his companions strike out on foot trails to climb the steep slopes of the valley. Just before the big reveal, Bingham and his companions stop to rest at the home of an indigenous family. He sits for a while on a wooden bench, on a wool poncho, sipping at a gourd of cold water and eating a sweet potato. The indigenous family, Bingham reports, told him, quote, that there were better ruins a little farther on. But, he comments, one can never tell in this country whether such a report is worthy of credence. In fact, in Bingham's writing in general, you see a sort of level of credence, and it's always the farther outside you are from Peru that the more Bingham lends trust to the claim. And indigenous people are least likely to be believed in his, so he comments in this way frequently. So, not sure if it's worthy of credence. Still, he determines to continue on, and the guide leads him up one last climb, past increasingly fine stone walls, and finally into the central plaza of the ruined city. There, Bingham notes, they came across some rude scrawls on the stones of a temple that indicated that a local muleteer named Lizarraga had visited in 1902. And he comments, the indigenous families living there had planted corn and vegetables on the terraces. Some had even taken up residence in the still standing buildings, adding new roofs. So Machu Picchu and the Urubamba Valley can only be virgin territory if none of these things, none of these visitors, and none of these residents count. I can't help but be reminded of a line from the 15th century explorer Jean de Verrazano, who wrote without irony that he had discovered, quote, a new country which had never been seen by anyone, and that he quickly, quote, perceived the great fires near the coast that meant that it was inhabited. So, how can the same man who excoriates his compatriots in the US for their paternalistic, interventionist take on Latin America tell such a story? How can we understand the context and the implications of Bingham's simultaneous disgust for the Monroe Doctrine's political effects and his apparently unconscious yet total embrace of its cultural mores? We could simply dismiss Bingham's anti-Monroe Doctrine writings as disingenuous or merely interested in US interests in the face of increased resistance from Latin America. But I think that's too simple. I think he's actually more complicated than that. I think instead what we can see in the tension between these two quotations is evidence of how thoroughly the cultural common sense of the Monroe Doctrine had already pervaded US sentiments by the early 20th century. It was unrecognizable to Bingham, even as he registered the more patent problems of the Monroe Doctrine caused, and he advocated for a more equal relationship among American neighbors. I think he was genuine in both of these aspects. Bingham denounced the Monroe Doctrine on political and economic grounds. It was for him a foreign policy and a matter of state-to-state interaction, which then trickled into and obstructed everyday relations. The fact that that spirit of hemispheric dominance and exceptional Americanness was also lived out in the bodies of American individuals like himself, their scholarly pursuits and their public presentations, was something so normal that he couldn't think it. There's a scholar of Ecuador who, talking about citizenship for indigenous people, says, what was unthought was unthinkable. That they could be citizens was neither thought nor thinkable. I think that's true in some ways for Bingham, that he can't think that there's a contradiction here. In that way, Bingham could argue forcefully that the political rhetoric of the Monroe Doctrine be abandoned while simultaneously voicing it at the cultural level, even aiding its evolution to fit new circumstances. Ironically, for all his earnest arguments aimed at changing US perspectives on Latin America, then, Bingham's most popular writing, his accounts of discovery, ascent of mountains, and exploration, helped accomplish the dispersal of the Monroe Doctrine from the realm of foreign policy into resilient cultural common sense. So, Hiram Bingham. Bingham was a scholar, an adventurer, and a politician. As Francisco and I were saying, he was an ace pilot in World War I. He was a senator who got censured for insider trading deals. He has this very rich, fascinating life. He published extensively on the archaeological history and contemporary politics of Latin America, and he relished the opportunity to do field research there. He may actually have been one of the models for the character of Indiana Jones, and it actually fits fairly well. Here he is. Casting himself in the mold of the previous century's traveler scholars, Bingham made several trips to South America in search of new material that would advance science and his own fame. When in 1909, while in Chile, he heard rumors of an extensive undiscovered Incan ruin in Peru, he jumped at the chance to explore them. He mounted his 1911 expedition that came across Machu Picchu, largely with private funds from his wife's family, and the National Geographic Society co-sponsored 2 return visits in 1912 and 1914. During those 3 expeditions, Bingham's teams conducted excavations at several sites across southern Peru, but he is most famous for having brought public attention to the ruins at Machu Picchu. The rather dramatic full tale of Bingham's Peruvian exploits is beyond my scope this afternoon, but let me touch briefly on the conclusion, because it shows further how the appropriative or paternalistic urge underlying Bingham's archaeological work sort of followed through. Through a series of misunderstandings and intentional manipulations, Bingham illegally carried thousands of pre-Columbian artifacts out of Peru between 1912 and 1915. Part of this was because he had been obliged, part of his funding from Yale carried an obligation to build the Peabody Museum's collection. And he wanted to preserve artifacts that he believed would otherwise be subject to looting and mishandling. He was very concerned with the Peruvian government's failure to treat Machu Picchu with respect, and the Peruvian government was fairly concerned with his inability to treat Machu Picchu with respect. The fact that his own team mishandled much of the excavation didn't lead him to rethink these priorities. But after a group of young Peruvian scholars raised questions about Bingham's export practices, a bit of a scandal emerged, and Bingham left Peru in some disgrace in 1915. The appropriated artifacts were only returned to Peru by Yale in 2011, on the 100th anniversary of Bingham's famous discovery. We must, in other words, read Bingham as thoroughly immersed in the appropriative urge that so concerns him about the Monroe Doctrine. But my real interest in Bingham comes from the fact that he didn't just carry that Monroeista assumption with him. I'm interested in him as a rhetorician because he disseminated it, because it went out from where he was into a wider public through his writing and through the photographs. Through lectures, articles, photographs, and books, he taught a wide section of the US public how to see these great pre-Columbian relics as quintessentially American, and the discovery of them as a quintessentially American activity. In the process, making a claim to the hemispheric right of the United States to do this kind of adventuring. Despite his frequent protestations that expeditions were scientific in nature, not the stuff of treasure hunts and adventure novels, Bingham carefully sought out media attention for his discoveries. The partnership with the National Geographic Society particularly provided him with a wide and well-informed public, circulating the words and images of his adventures to an ever wider audience. And it's to that National Geographic display that I'm going to turn now. Bingham prioritized photography throughout his adventures. In the archives at Yale, there's pages and pages and folders in which Bingham tries to teach good skills of photography to the other members of the expedition and talks about how important it is and tries to find good cameras, good film, or good glass plates to use. So he's very focused on this. in part because he recognized its capacity to index the real and invoke a sense of marvelous possibility. Photography offered both a means of scientific documentation and a tool for public outreach. In that spirit, the April 1913 issue of National Geographic featured a photo essay revealing Bingham's scientific discovery of Machu Picchu. That's the way they get around the fact that everybody had been there, scientific discovery. The article, titled "In the Wonderland of Peru," yeah, not yet, included more than 200 black and white photographs documenting the 1912 expedition and guiding viewers through the process of uncovering the awe-inspiring architecture of Machu Picchu. While Bingham's written narrative takes several pages to get underway, Bingham is, as far as I can tell, a terrible writer. He always starts in the middle of a story at the least interesting point and then goes into his story. He needed an editor like crazy. He gets there eventually, but so his writing takes forever to get started. But the first 16 pages of the article feature 12 full-page photographs and several partial photographs. And it's the photographs, though not yet showing Machu Picchu, that carry readers into the Andes and get them immersed in the story. Bustling shots of Lima quickly fade into rugged mountains, shaggy llamas, and poncho-wearing Quechua villagers. When, on page 18, readers get their first glimpse of a still vine-covered Machu Picchu, they are well aware of the distance that Bingham and his companions have traveled and the altitude they have gained. They have, in a sense, made the journey with the Yale Peruvian expedition. Once they arrived at Machu Picchu, readers also participated in its uncovering. Photography allowed viewers to enter the scene alongside the expedition, verifying its experience, sharing in its mysteries, and aiding in its discovery. They, like the expedition members, enacted a symbolic and material claim to Machu Picchu by seeing it, one characterized by the revelation of hidden wonders and the assertion of identification with Incan grandeur. Photographs and text throughout Wonderland emphasize the transformation of Machu Picchu. Again and again, Bingham shows how the expedition rescued the ruins and its extraordinary stonework from the jungle. And I'm going to focus on a couple panoramas of that uncovering as an example here, specifically the uncovering of Intihuatana Hill. That reclamation is visualized through 3 photographs explicitly, and then it shows up in other photographs as well. It's not structured as a sense of pre-planned before and after. So the pictures aren't set up before and after so much, but they show a sense of gradual unfolding. And it comes across in part because the photographs are in a chronological circle. So this is the first of the photographs, a post-uncovering photograph, titled An Architectural Triumph, Machu Picchu. It appears on the page prior to the before photograph, captioned, "A picture of the same part of the city of Machu Picchu as shown in the preceding illustration, but photographed the year before." The third photograph, Intihuatana Hill and the terraces west of the Sacred Plaza, appears several pages later, but the longer caption cross-references the earlier one, so it sends people flipping back. Visually, it's no mistake that the 2 post-clearing photographs appear in landscape, while the before photograph is in portrait. The pre-clearing photograph emphasizes vertical height, calling attention to the effort required to arrive in Machu Picchu and the risk inherent in the work to be done. It also, this is what I'm saying, it doesn't suggest a pre-planning. So if he were pre-planning, he might have tried to do the exact same shot to show pre and post. And this way it shows, oh, this is what we discovered over time, because he doesn't have those carefully planned shots. If you have a carefully planned before, then you know there's going to be an after. And this instead involves you in the process of uncovering. So, turning to the after photographs then, the revealed city in landscape appears vast but tamed. It spreads horizontally across the page and invites the viewer to marvel at the sheer scope of its construction. In this second after photograph, the snow-capped peaks, just barely visible in this shot, emphasize even further the epic scale on which viewers should measure the accomplishments of the Incas and the Yale Peruvian expedition. There's something echoing, actually, of the 19th century landscape painting in that decision to emphasize the mountains in the background. The photographs then link the recovery efforts of the Yale expedition to the original construction efforts of the Incas. This, viewers saw, was a great city built by a great civilization, and perhaps reclaimed by another. In his captions, Bingham offers guidance to help viewers connect the unmatched grandeur of the Incan Empire with the efforts of the visitors from the exceptional United States. In one case, for example, he instructed viewers to contrast this picture, which was taken after months of strenuous work, that's this one he's describing, with the picture on the following page, that's this one, taken in 1911. Uncovering the city, making space for broad vision, and even revealing the sublimity of how the ruins align with the peaks of distant mountains required months of strenuous work by the experts of the expedition. There are lots of moments in this article where they're showing expertise through through drawings that show the skill for building or the interpretation of mechanisms in the ruins that had rotted away. So they sort of show their expertise multiple ways. And then that gets carried through into the pictures in the process of uncovering. So the efforts of that labor, particularly the clarity with which you can see the city, were effects that are amplified by photography itself. So the mechanism of photography, because of the way it works with light, emphasizes questions of clarity and obscurity. So the fact that there's a brightness and a darkness is part of the work of how photography shows information. So photography emphasizes the connection between realism, a sense of this is what we have done, this is what we've achieved, and the effort of the real Peruvian expedition. So hard work, ingenuity, and clarity of purpose, American values perhaps, were essential to the revelation of Machu Picchu. The farming indigenous families and the graffiti-leaving muleteer could not provide that essential combination, and so they were effaced.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming on this beautiful day. That's Christa, you must have brought the good weather today.
I usually bring rain, so hey.
There you go. My name is Sarah Ripp. I'm the undergrad advisor and outreach coordinator for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. And we're so pleased to have you today. There's some new folks I've never seen before, so that's always fun. And we even have a new guy for our program, which we love.
Sign them up.
So there's coffee and tea and snacks in the back that you're welcome to. And there's also a sign-in sheet there if you're interested in being added to our listserv. We send out an email, sort of newsletter once a week of all of our events and some other things happening in the area that deal with our region.
It has also provided sustenance to one of the nation's enduring beliefs, the idea of American exceptionalism. Asserting a status as particularly American among other Americans relies on a network of assumed contrasts that consistently position the U.S. as the ideal representative of the New World. Anglo versus Iberian, segregation versus miscegenation, Protestant versus Catholic, republicanism versus despotism, and as always, the United States aimed toward the future and Latin America irrevocably tied toward the past. These contrasts consistently appear in U.S. discourse that sets up this idea of the United States as ideal. That claim to America has circulated widely and in multiple forms. It appears in speeches and pamphlets, paintings and film strips, magazine spreads, and travelers' accounts. Like all rhetorical discourse, and here if you are not a rhetorician is your definition of rhetoric, it is communication that has designs on the values and beliefs.
Rhetorical history, theory, and criticism, visual rhetoric, and Latin America. So Christa presenting work with her new book, Identity in Ecuador. I mean, it's a really, really wonderful book. So, Christa, welcome.
Thank you, LACIS, for having me. Thank you, Alberto, for the introduction and for bringing me into LACIS in so many different ways. I've appreciated it. And Sarah for coordinating this as well. So. The material that I'm going to share with you this afternoon comes from my relatively new book project. So the book about national identity in Ecuador has come out, and now I'm starting the new work. And I'm going to take a few seconds to set today's talk in the context of that larger project so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from. The new book is tentatively titled American Among Americans, Envisioning Hemispheric Power from the Monroe Doctrine to the Cold War. And it grapples with how visions and pictures of Latin America circulate within the idea of the United States. It started from a relatively simple question. How come the United States gets to be America when there are at least 24 American nation states? And while I'm not giving a history of the emergence of that concept, I am instead looking at how that claim to be American becomes common sense, becomes something that people in the US can say without even thinking about it. That US claim to unmodified use of a name shared by 2 continents worth of nation states is frequently unremarked in the United States, at least. But that tacit sense of possession has roots and implications that extend beyond simple matters of naming. It has undergirded the United States' rhetorical, political, and economic narratives of hemispheric dominance.
There's also a packet of info with a list of all the rest of the remaining lunchtime lectures for the rest of our semester, and some info about our program, some brochures. So thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to Alberto Vargas.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. One of the things that I really like about our program is that we are able to push the limits. And in this case, we're having a professor in English giving a lecture here in the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. That it's a really great pleasure. So Christa is an assistant professor in the Department of English. She got her PhD in University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and a master's from NYU, New York University, in performance studies. Christa is an expert in